Hello, everyone. Welcome to today's webinar. Our Reading the Room series centers on discussions with researchers, practitioners, and community members on the science of reading, evidence-based literacy instruction, and related policies that affect students and teachers. We're pleased to share the sixth event with you, focused on how to implement and strengthen your multi-tiered systems of support for reading, MTSSR. Today, panelists will share their perspectives on the factors and characteristics which are consistently associated with strong implementation of MTSSR and discuss how practitioners can implement a strong MTSSR that supports all students' reading development. At this time, I'd like to introduce you to Dr. Hank Feen. He's the director of NCIL, and he's going to provide you with a brief overview of NCIL.
Good morning, good afternoon, everybody. My name is Hank Feen, and I'm pleased to be here with you and very excited for the presentation and the session. We have some of my favorite people representing my favorite organizations across the country on here today, so I'm very excited. My colleagues and I run the National Center on Improving Literacy, NCIL. It was written in bipartisan legislation in ESSA. The funds flow through the Office of Elementary and Secondary Education, but the center is managed by OSEP, Office of Special Education Programs, given the context of who we're serving. Next slide. We have a very strong team. Boston University is the prime for NCIL, and our strong partners are Florida Center for Reading Research at Florida State University, the University of Oregon, and RMC Research. We have at least another dozen organizations that we work with very closely as we deliver technical assistance across the country. Next slide. So our charge, this was written in legislation. And our mission that has two fundamental parts. The first is to increase access to the evidence-based approaches to screen, identify, and teach students with literacy-related disabilities, including dyslexia. And the second is not just to provide access, but to facilitate the use of evidence-based approaches to screen, identify, and teach students with literacy-related disabilities, including dyslexia. We have 5 strands. The first one is related to assessment and screening to either identify or develop free or low-cost evidence-based assessment tools for identify students at risk for any literacy-related disability or difficulty. The second priority is to identify evidence-based programs, approaches, interventions, whether they be technology-based or print-based, so that consumers are aware of evidence-based instructional programs and practices. The third is to take the first 2 priorities related to assessment and instruction and intervention and translate that for parents so we can provide families support, tools, technologies, information about the evidence base and how to support their children. The fourth priority is to develop and deliver scientifically based technical assistance, whether it be targeted technical assistance or more intensive technical assistance to schools, districts, state departments, and other regional TA providers that work with schools and districts. Our final priority is sort of universal technical assistance, and it's disseminating information through our website, our webinars such as this, the Reading Room series, infographics. And so we try to get a broad reach to consumers on the evidence base. I think my next assignment is to introduce the moderator today. Dr. Nancy Nelson is a former special education teacher and school psychologist. She's currently an assistant professor of special education in the Wheelock College of Education and Human Development at Boston University, and is a deputy director of the National Center for Improving Literacy. Dr. Nelson has directed or co-directed more than a dozen federally funded projects to develop and test the efficacy of math and reading interventions for students with or at risk for learning disabilities. She regularly works with state, regional, and local education agencies to provide technical assistance related to the effective implementation of assessment and instruction in MTSS systems. So I'll hand it over to Dr. Nelson to lead the next activity.
Great, thanks, Hank. I'd like to now introduce our three panelists who've joined us today to share their perspectives on current issues related to implementing and strengthening multi-tiered systems of support, or MTSS, with a particular focus on reading. Dr. Jennifer Collins earned her doctorate in educational psychology from Indiana University of Pennsylvania and is a nationally certified school psychologist. She currently serves as the Pennsylvania statewide lead for MTSS for academics, or RTI, and has provided training and technical assistance at the national, state, and local levels. Her interests include helping school teams apply empirical research to practice in the areas of academics, behavior, and social emotional learning in order to help all students, including students with disabilities, realize improved outcomes. Dr. Kimberly St. Martin is the director of Michigan's MTSS Technical Assistance Center and co-director of the state's federally funded State Personnel Development Grant, or SPDIG. She is also a co-principal investigator of an Institute of Education Sciences grant called REACT, Initial Efficacy, testing the effects of a promising intervention to achieve equity in school discipline. Dr. St. Martin was a panel member for the recently released IES Practice Guide, providing reading interventions for students in grades 4 through 9. She also works with the National Center on Intensive Intervention as a center trainer. And last but not least, Dr. Michael Coyne is a professor of special education in the Neague School of Education at University of Connecticut and department head of educational psychology. His research focuses on beginning reading instruction and intervention, multi-tiered systems of support, and school-based experimental research. Dr. Coyne is currently a principal investigator of the National Research Network on Integrated MTSS and has worked with state departments of education to develop, implement, and evaluate statewide MTSS efforts and federal reading initiatives. So panelists, welcome. I'm thoroughly delighted to be talking with all of you today. I'm going to start with just a general overview of what MTSS is, and then we'll get into some questions for the panelists. So MTSS, multi-tiered systems of support, is a comprehensive multi-component approach to school service delivery that is intended to meet the needs of all students and each individual student. It involves the use of multiple tiers of instruction and intervention that increase in intensity and are matched to student need, regular collection and systematic examination of student and implementation data to inform decisions about instruction, and a host of infrastructure supports to facilitate implementation, including professional development and coaching and leadership engagement. So kicking off the panel, turning it over to the experts that are here and have joined us, I'm going to start with a basic but essential question to help frame the rest of our discussion on implementing effective MTSS approaches. Jennifer, there is sometimes confusion between MTSS and response to intervention, or RTI. Can you please clarify how these approaches are alike and how they're different?
Thank you, Nancy, and thanks for the opportunity to be here with my esteemed colleagues. The difference as we see it and as we unfolded this initiative in Pennsylvania a while ago is we framed multi-tiered systems of support as a comprehensive, as you mentioned, a comprehensive school improvement framework. And within that includes responsiveness to intervention, which we understand how those terms can be conflated. The similarities are that within a multi-tiered system of support, we are always looking at system or large group responses at the building level and grade levels, and then filtering down to the individual problem-solving level. So when we're doing that, we define RTI as a set of assessment methodologies that inform responsiveness, and particularly the kids who are demonstrating levels of intensity and severity of need that warrant the provisions of special education and or what we call the process for SLD determination. So we have rolled out a lot of training and technical assistance around the three primary ways to inform responsiveness to intervention from an assessment standpoint, and those would include early on rate of improvement, moving to student growth percentiles, and mastery measurement. You can calculate growth using any measure, but when we think about the cornerstones of assessment within a multi-tiered system of support, we bank heavily on the combination of CBM and mastery measurement.
Great, thank you. Yeah, that's a good distinction. I think it's important for people to know how the MTSS service delivery model is consistent with RTI, but RTI has a very specific focus that lends itself toward identification of students with specific learning disabilities in many states. Another thing that you mentioned was related to instruction and intervention in this MTSS system, and what that looks like, that we want students to be getting high quality instructional services as part of this approach. So how does, there's a lot of talk right now about the science of reading. So how does the science of reading fit within MTSS or not? And I want everyone to jump in, but Mike, can we start with you?
Yeah, sure. Thanks, Nancy. And it's really great to be here with you all. So I think, the short answer is that they absolutely support each other, and that they should support each other in a really intentional and coordinated way. So, the science of reading is all about understanding the extensive scientific research base on reading development and reading difficulties, and why students need effective reading instruction. And I like to think about MTSS as all about sort of adopting and implementing and coordinating effective practices that are supported by the science of reading. But I do think we need to be careful and acknowledge that just increasing teachers' knowledge about the science of reading isn't really enough. The science of reading tells us why we implement effective practices, but MTSS tells us how to implement those practices. And to really improve student outcomes, schools have to implement and coordinate multiple complex practices in assessment, instruction, intervention, and all of these things, these are really hard things to do. So MTSS offers schools an implementation framework for building these kind of school-wide systems and structures and routines that are really necessary to ensure that the reading practices supported by the science of reading are implemented with integrity and quality and consistency. So, another way to think about it is that science of reading efforts are necessary, maybe, but not sufficient for what we're trying to do in schools, and that increasing teachers' knowledge of science of reading is just one component of a comprehensive school-wide approach for teaching reading, which really is what MTSS is about.
Mike, I really like how you frame that. Because to your point, I see a lot of people talking about the science of reading as if it's in one category, and then there's MTSS, almost as if those two should not be touching. And I really agree with you. I think that MTSS is the path to effectively implement those evidence-based practices that are encapsulated in the science of reading. And we have to be talking about these two things together. So one of my favorite quotes from the book Results Now by Mike Schmoker says, "You place a good person in a bad system, the system wins every time." And so I really see MTSS as the infrastructure to support teachers and students in being able to do what's needed so all of our learners are achieving.
Great. Thank you both. Jen, do you want to comment on that too?
No, just simply it's a wonderful what-how partnership. What being that now 40 years of converging biological and behavioral research, the how being a multi-tiered system of support. So beautiful relationship when it intersects.
Yeah, for sure. So with all of that in mind and trying to support schools to effectively implement these systems, part of their doing this is figuring out which students need support and figuring out what types of support they need. So how can schools determine which students to support within each tier, and what should that support look like? You all have extensive experience in this area. Jen, I'm gonna turn it back to you and just to start.
Well, I think we start by talking about that what-how relationship and what the goals might be at the K1 levels when we're talking about discrete reading skills that have a beginning and an end versus the goals that we might establish from second grade onward. And we talk about how at the K1 levels, we really are shooting to help 100% of students reach benchmark by spring of kindergarten and spring of first grade. For second grade onward, we know that it's going to be a struggle to get to 100%, but we know that in a lot of cases, the 90-90-90 schools being one example, that 90-10 splits are feasible if we have operative, viable, sustainable models in place. So I think first to just talk about the goals, and then looking at kids getting to benchmark on time, that tier 1 isn't enough and tier 3 isn't enough, but the combination of those things can really help to expedite growth and shift that curve, the achievement curve, to the right toward those percentages that we just mentioned.
And so you're talking about MTSS as a prevention-oriented model, which is not something that I said at the very beginning of this, but it certainly is, and it's something where we want to be looking at data early on to provide students with that access to that support they need, so they don't get behind if we don't have those gaps that persist often throughout elementary school and widen over time. The role of data is obviously very important in all of that, including screening data for making those initial decisions, particularly as students get a little bit older and we don't necessarily know which students need support. So thinking about then the system and how we move toward intensifying supports for students who haven't responded when we've assigned them to tier 1 and tier 2, they've gotten really effective core reading instruction in early elementary school. They've gotten some good, effective supplemental tier 2 support in addition to that tier 1 support. We have students that still aren't responding. So hopefully not very many kindergarten and first graders, but maybe some. And then for those students that are older, certainly where those gaps have begun to emerge, what can we do? So what strategies and approaches do you recommend for intensifying instruction for students who have experienced these kinds of reading difficulties based on current and emerging research in the field? Kim, I'm going to turn it over to you. I can tell you're ready to go.
I'm ready to go. I also think that we would be remiss if we didn't talk about some of the common implementation pitfalls associated with MTSS. And frankly, high quality tier 1 is like one of the main implementation pitfalls. And I know that I've seen some of the questions, that are being posed about making sure that you have high quality tier 1 resources. And I'm just going to be really honest. We've had a history over the years of almost like a bait and switch. We have things that we know are not aligned with the science. And we've got publishers or, people who adjust the wording and label it as, okay, this is SOR aligned. Kind of like for those of us who remember the Common Core state standards, everything within like 9 months was CCSSO aligned. So I do think there are resources out there to guide districts in making high quality decisions around tier 1 curriculum resources to strengthen tier 1, because if we don't strengthen tier 1, then we're flooding tier 2 with intervention. Hoping that does not happen. What are some of the best practices for intensifying? I am a big advocate, and we advocate even within our state, within the state of Michigan, for putting in the hands of teachers and other staff who are intervention providers, standard treatment protocol interventions. There are very good, high quality, evidence-based intervention resources that have demonstrated effectiveness with students. And so beginning with a solid, my colleague, Dr. Sharon Baum, will say intervention platform, beginning with a solid platform by which we are providing intervention is going to be very important. And then making sure that we've got good practices like Jen, my colleague, had said, we have practices for progress monitoring. Those high quality intervention resources typically have in-program mastery assessments to give teachers feedback every 4 to 5 lessons on the quality of the instruction and what did students learn, what needs reteaching, et cetera. And then so you're using that data to determine instructional response. And then, based on how students are responding to the intervention instruction, this is where we want schools to really hone in on some of those variables that could be adapted or altered to intensify the instruction, making it more explicit as one example, making sure that there's some attention to transfer, helping kids generalize what they're learning in intervention, looking for ways to help them generalize that in their classroom space, in their classroom setting. So knowing those variables, if you will, that can be intensified is important when people are thinking about intervention. Good intervention platform plus variables to intensify the intervention instruction and using data along the way are essential.
Yeah, can I add to that too? Yeah, Kim, I really like what you were saying, which is that, you know, intensity exists in multiple dimensions and kind of on a continuum. So, you know, too often you just see what it means is switch a tier, or you're using a really good program and you say, well, we have to ditch it and start with a brand new program. And those are the like two ways to increase intensity. And another thing that I think is just really fundamental, but really important, is how much direct instruction in reading are students getting. You know, kind of increasing that amount of time or dosage is really critical with increasing the intensity. So really thinking about, you know, if you're getting supplemental intervention, how much extra time are you getting? How many minutes per day? How many days per week? And you know, that really adds up. And one of the things that I think is a pitfall is, you know, increasing the intensity by, say, moving up tiers, when the actuality is that kids are actually receiving less time for intervention. And that doesn't happen all the time, but you sometimes see that where like someone in tier 2 may be getting actually more intervention days per week, minutes per day, than they might if they move up into tier 3. And then the last thing I'll say about that, which is, you know, it really matters too, like, is this really, if it's supposed to happen every day, is it happening every day? How much time does it take for transitions in and out? Like, how many times does it get canceled because it's just easy to sort of not do it today, or there's something else that's happening? And that's for tier 1 too, like protecting that time for the high quality tier 1 instruction and protecting that time that's allocated for intensive tier 2 and tier 3 intervention.
I would just add
Yeah,
one. Yeah, sorry. I would just add to what Kim and Michael both said, and Pennsylvania, you know, thanks to all the work that the critical work that the National Center on Improving Literacy has done, and otherwise, where we have adopted enhanced core reading instruction in many of our schools across the Commonwealth, and that'll continue to grow. But that's been huge in helping teachers understand how to deliver explicit instruction. So they shouldn't have to worry about the design. They should be able to really focus on the delivery, and those routines have been essential in robusting up core instruction, then within that continuum offering some powerful options, as Kim mentioned, at the tier 3 level. So that continuum in and of itself has been just immensely helpful to Pennsylvania educators, and we continue to see the outcomes rise. We know that there's never going to be one tool alone, but you know, to Michael and Kim's points, explicit instruction is at the heart of what's effective. We just have to help people understand what that looks like, feels like, and sounds like for a continuum of kids with a continuum of needs. And also help people understand what their proportional roles are. So we talk a lot about how classroom teachers really need to bridge or be the broker, so to speak, to help all kids, including the most vulnerable kids, access core instruction, because, you know, Michael mentioned it's a big part of the day, and you could be disengaged for a lot of those periods of whole group instruction. And then at the tier 3 level, understanding that a lot of that's happening at instructional level. So when in this bidirectional model, when those two worlds come together, through very explicit instruction, particularly for our most vulnerable kids, you know, we can realize some of those outcomes that we'd like to see.
That's great. Yeah. So in addition to examining data, different types of data, examining our implementation data to make sure that what we're doing is actually effective and aligned with the how and the what, right, of the science of reading and MTSS. we need to be critical also about who's at the table and who's involved and who knows what to do in the system, making sure that everybody has an understanding of their role and their part, and everybody kind of needs to have a part. So I want to transition to that question. Just at the school level, on the, sort of the most fundamental level, who needs to be involved in MTSS implementation, and what is the role of school leadership in particular related to implementation of MTSS?
Yeah, so I clearly seem to be the person who's quoting things in books today. So I gave you my first quote. I'm going to give you my second one. So a lot of my work has been in educational leadership. So any educational leader out there, you've probably surely read a Michael Fullan book. And so there's one of my favorite quotes from Michael Fullan is he cautions administrators from falling into the heroic leadership trap, which really is that the weight of the world in terms of the implementation successes, lack thereof, the ability to achieve or obtain increases in student outcomes falls on the leader's shoulders. And that just is not, that's just not realistic. And so when we think about effective implementation, and in this context, we're talking about MTSS as a pathway for effective implementation, teaming structures, the role of teams to support the administrator in ensuring that there is collective, shared, distributed leadership in the work that has to happen in order to have an effective MTSS framework. So at the elementary space, some of the teaming structures that are really critical to getting MTSS up and running, certainly your school or building leadership team, also your grade level teams, that, you know, getting teachers together to look at the quality of their tier 1 class-wide reading instruction, for example. How do you build upon assets? How do you look for opportunities to enhance the instruction? But also a multidisciplinary team, or some people would say like a student support team. This would be a team that within our state, we say holds the baton in ensuring school-wide access for intervention and really keeping a pulse on the quality of intervention and student effectiveness. So those 3 teaming structures are critical. The only other teaming structure I would add, in addition to those 3 at the secondary level, would be the department teams, because the department teams, which we're going to talk about shortly, have a really important role in engaging core subject areas in this MTSS journey. But you can't put it on the principal. So teams are critical to being able to have a role in engaging in learning and then acting upon that learning to support implementation.
I would just add, you know, to Kim's point, that we try to just use a lot of medical analogies. You know, schools are like hospitals with layers of doctors, general practitioners, ear, nose, and throat, and neurosurgeons. The point being that in a seamless system of support, everyone has access to evidence-based practices at any given point in any student's learning journey. The degree to which a given doctor uses those practices might vary. You know, if your role is proportionally a classroom teacher versus a reading specialist or a special education teacher. But you don't want to go to a building and say, you know, who's the best person here to teach explicit phonics instruction, have Kim raise her hand, but not Michael. We want everyone to raise their hands around all critical aspects of comprehensive reading instruction and related outcomes.
Yeah, that's great. It's really important for all of those roles to engage. Absolutely. Kim started to hit on something that I want to circle back to, and it relates to one of the questions that we've gotten in the Q&A as well, which is, and so the question I hear a lot, I'm sure you all do too, what do these MTSS systems look like in secondary schools, and how do they differ from elementary schools?
So it is, adolescents are just my passion. Of course, I have 3 at home, so that could be part of the reason why. But I really believe at the secondary level, it's a multi-pronged approach. You have to engage your core subject area teachers at a minimum. And I have schools that are really focusing on elective teachers, are looking at ways to infuse very important and meaningful strategies that are going to support students in understanding the content that is being taught in those spaces, and are looking for ways to put text in front of kids to help and support their reading and ability to make meaning of what they're learning in the class, in the core subject area space. And so that is one prong that takes your, like that, I would say is tier one, that takes your core subject area teachers having a concerted effort to think about what kids are doing before they start engaging in reading, while they're reading, and after they've read. Now, truth be told, if my colleagues who were a part of the IES practice guide panel were on the call, we would have to be very honest that at the secondary level, kids don't have a lot of opportunities to even engage with text. And that is something that a lot of the secondary schools that many of us are working with, they're looking for ways to ensure that kids are they have access to text, they're reading text to further their understanding of the subject that is or the topic that's being discussed in the class. So that is tier one, plus intervention is very critical. And then making sure that there's a communication link between the intervention providers and the core subject area teachers, because we've got to support kids generalizing or transferring the strategies that they're using in intervention into their core subject area spaces. So I actually have watched science teachers infuse a strategy to help kids decode multisyllabic words. And it's the same exact strategy that's used in the intervention space. And the teacher does it brilliantly without drawing attention to that this is something that some kids are getting in intervention. They very much present it as adults, we still use our decoding skills. There are words we come to that we do not know how to, we can't pronounce accurately, effortlessly without trying something. Here's a strategy that you can use. So those things really make up kind of in a short version, what I would consider a secondary multi-tiered system of support.
I just want to comment on that based on your experiences.
I'm sorry, Nancy, who are you pointing to?
Oh, just any of you, if anyone wants to comment on that related to secondary implementation.
Just jump in to, again, support what Kim has said. In Pennsylvania, we start with a gated screening process at the secondary level, and as many states do, we have growth data as well. And we follow Mark Shin's work. I really like what he's done with secondary MTSS. So we identify in schools the subset of the population who is situated in quintile 1, the bottom quintile of achievement. And without having to do a lot of diagnostic work, you know that these are students who are can't do kids. They are 2 or more years below grade level and have real legitimate difficulty accessing core instruction. So what Mark Shin's work has been about, or has been advocating, is helping to bring those students through a tier 3 level of support, if you will, to what he calls a minimum level of skill proficiency. And the LEA defines what that is. To be able then to access core instruction. Gen Ed teachers, content teachers would be responsible for whole group instruction and again, small group differentiated instruction to help those kids access core instruction. So again, it's still a bidirectional model. The difference is we already know who's experiencing low achievement, and then mobilizing personnel. And again, those evidence-based practices, as Kim mentioned, across tiered providers to close those gaps. Again, it's about shifting the curve to the right, but the kids have got to realize above typical growth to do that. And so that growth data is really instrumental in helping us identify the kids and then mobilize the supports so that the infrastructure is supporting the implementation of the secondary level.
Great, thank you. That's helpful. I hope that those in the audience who are looking for answers to that question got something out of it that they can go back and implement. I want to kind of switch to sort of a broader focus. We recognize that these systems are complex. There are a lot of components, challenging to implement. So we were planning on talking about this question, but it was also asked by the audience. What are the biggest obstacles that you see schools encounter in their efforts to implement MTSS? I know that there are many.
I can start with that one. I think one of the things that one obstacle is that we already talked about a little bit today, but is about thinking about different reading initiatives in silos. We have science of reading, and we're really interested in that and committed to that. So we have a team leading that work, and there's dedicated professional development related to that. We're invested in supporting students with dyslexia, so we have a team leading that work, and there's more professional development related to that. We're adopting a new core program, so that's sort of a different team. And so even if these initiatives are well-intentioned and evidence-based, if they're not if they are thought of as separate, distinct efforts, it can often result in like real sort of fragmented supports, and they might use different terminology and language. Professional development may look very different, and it can sort of end up working at cross purposes. And to me, that's exactly what MTSS is for, which is, developing this kind of coordinated school-wide plan and infrastructure that's able to, kind of take all these different initiatives and efforts related to reading and put it all under one umbrella. So, to me, anything related to reading in a school should be accommodated within a school's MTSS framework, and the school leadership team should be the team that has sort of ultimate kind of oversight of all those types of initiatives. So I think, and I think, kind of adding to that a little bit is that, we talk a lot about effective practices in assessment and intervention, and the great thing is we have such a strong evidence base of what works. Like, we probably know how to teach reading better. We know more about reading than kind of any other area in education, probably. But I do think that we underestimate the support that schools need to build these systems and infrastructure to fully implement and sustain and coordinate these practices. And I think that's why MTSS is so exciting and promising, because it kind of provides this model or framework for how we take these different kind of practices that we know are necessary, but helps to coordinate those at a school level or a district level.
Thanks, Mike. Others, what are your thoughts?
Well, I kind of talked about, two pitfalls for MTSS. So I guess you could say obstacles. Poor quality tier 1, flooding tier 2 with intervention. But there's also that there typically between tier 2 and tier 3, there isn't a distinct level of intensity. And so oftentimes, we've seen, tier 2 kind of looks a lot like tier 1, and it isn't really more intensive, if you will, than what you may get if you were using something like a standard protocol intervention. And so I do think that is another challenge. I also think that it's a challenge, and an obstacle to implementing MTSS is to silo social, emotional, behavior supports from the academic supports. We do know the importance of an integrated model. For folks on the call who, remember Randy Sprick, you may have heard him present. He used to say it's the ultimate chicken and egg question. I've heard Rob Horner and many others in the PBIS community say the same thing. What do you address first? And we know that kids need safe, predictable, engaging environments. And for many of our students, in this case, from a reading perspective, they could be in middle school and they have found reading to be challenging since first grade. And so if I'm an 8th grader and you're going to ask me to do something that I have a low perceived probability of success, I am likely to find ways to escape or avoid that, which does lead to oftentimes escalating behavior. And so when we work with schools in the state of Michigan, we really emphasize the integration of social, emotional, behavior supports with the academic supports.
I would just add some people variables. Every LEA has its own politics, personalities, and philosophies. And so to harness that as a leader through shared leadership and build capacity over time, again, that what-how relationship requires a level of persistence and commitment that sometimes is unprecedented in light of other equally important variables like teacher shortages and stress and whatever's coming down the pike. So balancing that for, an average person in an average school, notwithstanding, the principal or school leaders, and making that system work cohesively is a huge, huge charge. And so I think we try to assume that people are doing the best they can, and the most successful places are the places that keep an operative, sustainable, viable, multi-tiered system of support on the front burner. And the heart of that is making sure that there are structures in place to support ongoing context-embedded professional development using resources that are reliable and valid. The NCIL is one example of a resource. NCII, where Kim is at or helping with, is another resource. But otherwise, if training and technical assistance isn't there to support or guide people toward those entities or resources, teachers are going to find what they can find, whatever they feel is accessible, and those may not be the best resources. So it's a tough thing. If you look at the NERN, pieces, implementation is easy or hard. And if it were easy, more people would be getting to the goals that we talked about. But it requires collective skill and will. You can give people skill, but I think the will is understated sometimes.
And those are great points. One of the things that I see in my work in the field, unfortunately, is sort of a regression to the siloing of instruction and intervention. So regressing back to the model, there was a traditional model of special education, right? There's general education over here, there's special education separately. We came up with an MTSS structure in part to try and manage that, to try and support students before they were getting to special education. So a big challenge, I think, that the field is facing is making sure that they're reserving time for Tier 2 support that is meaningful and effective for students in this prevention-oriented framework. Another thing that I think is interwoven with everything that all of us are saying is this issue of language and the language that we use to describe things. And it often kind of plagues me or haunts me why I get kind of befuddled at how difficult it is for educators to sometimes make connections between something I'm saying and something they might have heard from somewhere else that has the exact same intent. Maybe the name of the specific school team we're talking about is a different name, but the intent of both is the same. And certainly as a researcher, technical assistance provider, professor, my job is to try and make those connections more clear, so that isn't an issue that the field has to grapple with. But there's so much knowledge that I think needs to be built around these issues to allow people to make those connections between the intent of these structures and not get lost in some of the verbiage associated with it. Are there other obstacles that you would identify that you want to talk about for the audience today?
Okay, well, so
or ways to manage the obstacles. That's where we're going next.
Well, I see, I mean, I'm looking at some of the questions that are here, that everyone has provided, and ways like, I mean, I'm thinking a lot about how do you bring people on board? How do you bring lawmakers, district leaders? How do you bring people together to really enact change, meaningful change to accelerate reading outcomes? And that's a really good question, because I have a lot of folks that say to me, well, you can't intervene your way out of a Tier 1 problem with MTSS. So there's a lot of emphasis on Tier 1. Agree, totally agree. And you've got to really also think about high quality intervention supports for students, because you have kids that do have this need. And so, so I just think that it's not one or the other. It's not either addressing Tier 1 and hang out and wait until you get Tier 1 really strong and then do the advanced tiers. It's a combination of both. And you've heard Jen and others talk about this bidirectionally, and I really believe that's needed. I will just mention, at the middle school, high school space, I have found right, wrong, or indifferent, the hook is intervention. A lot of the secondary folks are like, yes, my students need intervention. So I have had schools that are really excited about thinking about intervention. And then we've got to really get tier one, which is engaging your core subject area teachers involved to give the full package. But even at secondary, it's both. It's not just one or the other. Same thing with at the elementary level.
I like that, Ken. That's really important. So approaching the triangle from both ends. Mike, looks like you were going to jump in and add.
Yeah, this is maybe moving to the next thing, but about the, kind of how to overcome obstacles. And I think, the reality is that MTSS is hard to do. But I do think, schools that have really high quality kind of coordinated MTSS efforts support teachers incredibly. It becomes almost like a web of support for teachers. And this is completely sort of qualitative evidence from myself. But when the pandemic happened, it felt to me that schools that had really good MTSS system in place were better able to kind of pivot because they had a kind of organized, coordinated system of support for all teachers. I really think of it as, moving away from this solo practitioner model of teaching where it's every person for themselves in their classroom, kind of making it up as they go. And, they are responsible for those students. And instead, the whole school or the whole district is responsible for students and responsible for making sure that teachers have what they need to be able to meet the needs of those students. And so I think, there's a lot of obstacles and barriers to kind of fully implementing MTSS, but there's a huge benefit to both, the teachers in the schools, the administrators, and also, ultimately the students, because we know that if you implement the kind of evidence-based practices that are part of MTSS, we know from lots and lots of research that improves student reading outcomes.
I would just add in terms of solutions, a quote, and I'm sorry, I don't remember who made this quote, but if they want to, they will. And I think that says a lot because sometimes our expectations, including myself, are too high, in the face of systems change and what we know about systems change. We're not going to get 80% in one fell swoop, but the coalition of the willing at a grade level might be a third. That's realistic. And the other 2/3 will watch that third. And if that third wants to move forward with scaling something slowly on a smaller level at the grade level, then I think it's incumbent that the larger team and outside technical assistance, if it's available, wrap around that, those people. So it then gets legs, it gets traction. Joe Kowaleski used to use that word a lot, getting traction and using that third then to sustain the scaling efforts school-wide then. But that quote resonates with me. If they want to, they will. And I think we need to search for who it is that's presenting as wanting to, and then go from there.
Yeah, that's great. I do think that this is an urgent problem when we're talking about students' reading skills and reading development, and not waiting, right? Not waiting until the dust has settled and things are calm to be able to begin implementing aspects of MTSS. So jumping in and getting started right away. So those structures are in place the next time something happens, and it is easier to pivot and support all learners in your system. Are there other sort of solutions that you would offer for schools that are trying to implement effective MTSS? So we know that there's a lot of stuff going on. There are teacher shortages. There are a host of issues. But are there certain things that you would tell schools who are trying to get started right now? Some advice for them. What would you say?
Well, I do think that professional learning, I mean, I know this seems so obvious, but I think professional learning is key. And I really believe that people who are going to embark on implementing MTSS, I think you can imagine I'm an explicit instruction fan. So a clearly defined scope and sequence of professional learning that is going to, in my opinion, begin with our classroom teachers, creating safe, predictable, and engaging environments. I really do believe that that includes increasing student engagement strategies and opportunities to respond. I think that's a great first set of learning for our educators, especially since we're still in the fall and school's relatively new. And then I believe that systematically we need to be layering on additional learning that sometimes is with your school leadership team, sometimes is with your multidisciplinary team who's going to oversee intervention, and sometimes with your grade level team. And so I kind of consider MTSS to be almost like a well choreographed dance, that you have to think about the moves that are needed to systematically teach people and then support the implementation of what goes into each of the tiers. And again, it's integrating the social emotional behavior with the academic supports.
I think that's great. And, the professional learning that supports the teachers and supports the school move this work forward is really important. And I would also add, the real value and power of really good instructional tools and materials and programs. There's been a lot of really good work about developing and evaluating intervention programs, and thinking about the resources that come with a core reading program for Tier 1. I sometimes think that we do teachers a disservice if we're sort of making them be instructional designers. What teachers are good at is teaching, right? So if we could give them the tools and the materials that are gonna start that, be able to kind of be in a teaching environment, then they're freed up to do the things that they're best at, which is respond to students in the moment, and engage in those kind of learning interactions when the kind of back end has already been, developed by a team of folks that are experts in that. And so I think, relying on effective instructional tools and materials at all tiers is a real kind of support for schools that are working towards this. And aligning the professional learning with those specific tools. Sometimes we have really great professional learning, but teachers don't know, what does that mean when I'm implementing our intervention program? But if those things can be really tied together, then I think that's even more powerful.
Yeah, agreed. Another thing, this will be the last thing I think that we hit on before we wrap up today, but we started to talk a little bit about implementation data, and sort of, you think about these systems as being complex, multi-component. There's a lot to implement and to implement well. Maybe your school, hopefully, gets to a place where they are implementing well, but there's this issue around sustainability, right? And so recognizing that you're going to have to sustain these systems over time. It requires effort, it requires focus. It also requires examining your practice, right? So we're talking about student data as being an important driver of figuring out who needs support, what level of support, what that support should look like. We as educators within the system also need to be examining the systems level data around the implementation of our practice and using that implementation data to refine and improve our practice, because I think collectively, I would assume all of us on this panel agree that continuous improvement is a real thing we all strive for, and that schools should be striving for as part of their work to implement MTSS to support sustaining these structures over time, given other changes that might be happening within and outside of the school system. I don't know if you have any comments on that before we wrap up, but I'll throw that out to the group too.
I think you said it well, Nancy, that, the DNA, so to speak, of sustainable multi-tiered systems of support can't live in individual people. It has to live in practices and processes that you sustain over time, so that when you leave, I'm still here and Kim's still here and Michael's still here doing the good work. And yeah, that's hard to do. That's a part of, I think, what Kim was mentioning earlier about transformational leadership and transactional leadership. Those two pieces have to come together so that you have sustainability. And we can operationalize those many different ways, but it comes down to the practices and processes that live on when people are going to naturally go.
Excellent. Well, again, I want to thank you all for being here. Our time is up. I know we could probably talk about these topics at length for days on end, but I really appreciate you sharing your expertise with me and with the audience. I also want to thank Wheelock College of Education and Human Development for hosting this Reading the Room panel series. And I will turn it back over to Sarah Seiko, who can close us out.
Thank you so much, Nancy. And thank you to BU Wheelock for hosting this event, our panelists for sharing their perspectives and experience, and our attendees for participating today. We hope you join us for future Reading the Room events. You will receive a recording of today's event, and it will also be posted on the NCIL website. A brief feedback form for the event will automatically launch in your web browser when you leave the webinar, and we kindly ask that you complete it then. To stay abreast of the latest NCIL news and information, please follow us on Facebook at Improving Literacy or on Twitter at NCI Literacy, and sign up for our newsletter at improvingliteracy.org. Thank you again for joining us for the 6th Reading the Room event in our series and your interest in promoting evidence-based literacy practices. Enjoy the rest of your week. Thank you.